Okay. This is our project for CSE 564 visualization, in which we've constructed a Plotly Dash app that presents data on structural racism, criminal justice reform protests, and United States exonerations ranging from the years 2021 to 2023. So the goal of our project was to create an interactive dashboard that would allow the user to understand the extent to which structural racism affect index factors, criminal justice reform protests, and other demographic factors might interact with one another in the context of exonerations. So different patterns might elucidate novel findings regarding exoneration distributions in the United States, and these findings might have important implications for criminal justice reform and could inform future research on wrongful convictions in general. So the way that we've structured our data is that we've collected all of the occurrences of exonerations between 2021 and 2023 from the National Registry of Exonerations database. So every single row in that database represents an exoneration case. And then we've merged all of those cases with corresponding data at the state and year level for structural racism effect index variables. That's coming from what's called the SREI, Structural Racism Effect Index database. So that includes lots of other state level variables. For example, wealth inequality, transportation inequality, employment inequality, education inequality, social cohesion, income poverty, housing, criminal justice. It also includes population for those states. And um, each of these variables, for each of them, a more positive number indicates more inequality, and a more negative number indicates less inequality. And those are all mean-centered. Um, Also, we've included protests of any protests that related to criminal justice reform from the Crowd Counting Consortium database. Um, and so those are any protests that were related to criminal justice that occurred in the same year and in the same state as any of the exoneration rows within the NRE database for those years that we took. Um, so I'm going to pass over the presentation now to my colleague, and Ariek's going to tell us a little bit about the dashboard that we've created.
Yeah, so to achieve the goals that Carl stated, we created a dashboard with four main elements, all of which interact with each other. Up here, we have parallel coordinates. This shows the structural racism effect index and all of its components, the number of protests, and the age and race of the individuals who are exonerated. So each of these lines represents one exoneration in the selected year. We'll go back to 2021. And the SREI variables and protests come from the state in which that exoneration took place. We also see three different colors that represent three groups. So we have our cluster that represents exonerations that occurred in states with a low SREI, ones from states with a medium SREI, and ones with states from states with a high SREI. Here we have our multidimensional scaling plot of all of our attributes. The blue represents positive correlation among attributes, and the orange represents negative correlation. The thicker the line, the stronger the correlation. We can select attributes in order to view them on our scatter plot. And the scatter plot also can show the differentiation among exonerations in the different SREI clusters. And finally, we have our choropleth map, which allows us to directly compare our attributes with the exonerations per capita with this quick toggle. So when we say exonerations per capita, it's the number of exonerations per number of incarcerated people in that state. And what this toggle allows us to do is to choose a state, let's say Texas, and see, okay, there's a low per capita exoneration rate, and it has a medium social cohesion factor, and quickly move back and forth between them. So now we're going to look at some of the results. One more thing I wanted to mention too is that later we're going to highlight our brush and link between our map and the parallel coordinates and scatter plot, but I'm going to leave that to Carl at the end. So I'm going to start discussing some of the results we found. We see that the structural racism effect index attributes are all positively correlated, which makes sense because they are all on the same scale, with a negative number meaning less racial inequality and a positive number meaning more. But our protests are negatively correlated with the SREI attributes. And this is surprising. This means that there's fewer racial justice protests in states that have more inequality, which is kind of contrary to what we would expect. Employment, education, transportation, and wealth are all very useful for distinguishing between the three types of states in this data set. Again, the data set is not all of the states. It's states in which there were exonerations. So we might see that all of the SREI variables led to these clear three clusters if all states were included. For housing and criminal justice, we really don't see this separation. So housing, higher numbers mean that the housing is in poorer condition, there's more evictions. Lower numbers mean better conditions, fewer evictions. And we see that housing can't distinguish between low SREI and medium SREI states. And with criminal justice, where higher numbers represent more jailings, more police presence, and lower numbers mean fewer police per capita, less jailing. We see that only in the most extreme cases of high SREI do we see the points separating out from everything else. There really, criminal justice does not help to distinguish between states. Moving over to the map, looking at the number of exonerations per capita regionally, for the 3 years, we notice that Illinois and Massachusetts have the highest number of exonerations per capita over time. And we also notice similar states in the Midwest and some of the southern states have no exonerations for the whole period. In terms of protests and how this relates, if we again focus on Illinois and Massachusetts, you'll notice that Illinois has high number of protests throughout this period, while Massachusetts has a low number of protests. If we look at exonerations in states with high numbers of protests, New York and California, we will notice that New York has a high number of exonerations per capita and California a low number over the course of the period. And finally, in areas where we don't have exonerations, we notice that there tend to be very few protests. So the protest results are mixed. I think we expected to see that in states that had more social and criminal justice reform related protests, we would have more exonerations. But here we really see mixed results, except for in the regions where there aren't exonerations. Another thing to note is for the SREI index, if we look at, again, regions that do not have exonerations, in particular Arizona and Alaska, we notice a very high level of SREI in these areas. And now I am going to pass it to Carl to finish up with the brushing and linking and some other interesting results.
Okay, so I'm just going to review a little bit more of the interactivity of our dashboard. And so, as we talked about before, it's really interesting that the protests do not relate to the different SREI indicators. Um, so if we look at protests and the way that they relate to indicators such as wealth, you can see that there's this really interesting downward trend. And This just shows a little bit about some of the interactivity of our dashboard as well. So you can also filter according to the different clusters. Um, so we use k-means clustering to differentiate between these low SREI, medium SREI, and high SREI variables. But then you can see, again, just as we were displaying before, this really interesting pattern that for whatever reason, these protests for criminal justice reform are not happening so much in areas where there is low inequality, but happening very much more so or sorry, there's a lot of protests happening in areas with low inequality, and there's a lot of representation of exonerations happening in areas of high inequality. But for some reason, there's no protests going on in those areas, or a lot fewer protests going on in those areas, at least in the context of exonerations. So next, I'll just show how these different elements all sort of interact with each other. So we've already shown that you can filter the data um, according to the year. You can also show whether or not you want to see one of these numeric variables, or if you want to see just the exonerations per capita, um, and can easily toggle back and forth between those. Um, but importantly, if you wanted to look at some specific trends according to regions of the United States or specific states within the US, you can use span level highlighting to isolate particular areas and then select specific years and isolate those areas as well. And then that will show the data in both the parallel coordinates plot and the scatter plot um, to indicate the user selection. Um, So what's really interesting is that by doing some of this more fine-grained highlighting, it will reveal that some of the clusters are um, regional. So it looks like, so if we go back over the full database, you can see that um, the Northeast region, so if we just go down here, we're only seeing medium and low SREI representations, at least in the exonerations that are occurring there. Um, the reason I say exonerations again is just because every row in the database is representing a case where somebody was exonerated. Um, so the South, we see, if we just go over these southern states, oops, um, we just see a lot of high structural racism effect index. So there's a lot of disparity related to the exonerations happening in those areas. Um, if we just look at the West Coast, it's only medium. And then if we look in the middle of the US, we're just seeing medium and high disparities. So you can see that a lot of this clustering is not only just occurring across exonerations, or it's not just relative to exonerations, but it's regionally defined across the US. So these patterns can differentiate according to whatever region you're most interested in looking at. Um, so now I'll just go over a little bit about the parallel coordinates plot and something pretty interesting that we found to wrap up. Um, So since we've been looking at the way the protests interact with the variables, you can see once again that this low SREI, these blue lines are really way up here. So there's a lot of protests happening in that area. So next I'm going to show how just moving around the parallel coordinates helps us even better understand the way that these clusters are defined. So of course we can see that the high SREI, the medium SREI, and the low SREI are spreading out, or they're filtering out from each other quite nicely um, on the left side of this parallel coordinates plot. But when I drag over race, for example, we can see how race is related to these other SREI indicators, and it looks like there's not a whole lot of differentiation according to race. However, we can clearly see that if we drag over age, that um, these low SREI variables are starting to really characterize, or the low SREI cluster is starting to really be characterized by younger ages of the exonerated persons. So this is the age that the person was when they are exonerated. And you can see this even better if you just highlight the lower region. Um, you can see almost all of the blue lines are being represented down at these lower ages. So even down around 20 years old, which is really young, um, relative to the rest of the range of ages, which goes all the way up to 64. But then the further up that we go, um, there's a lot more representation with the medium and high SREI indicators. So it doesn't really give us a causal explanation for why these exonerations of the younger individuals are happening at lower ages, but that does give us some insight as to um, like it's possible that maybe younger ages are more easily prioritized, maybe exoneration cases are more easily prioritized in these areas with lower disparity. Maybe there's just more resources. Of course, these are areas where there's a lot less wealth disparity, for example. Um, so this would be pretty interesting to communicate to innocence organizations, especially when they want to advocate for more resources and more funding. It's possible that maybe these cases just take a really long time, and maybe they have an easier time in areas where there's less wealth disparity. We don't know that for sure, but at least it gives us there is some kind of pattern going on here that's relating these younger ages to um, the lower SREI. So that was one really interesting finding that came out of this, besides what we found with the protests. And overall, I think it gave us a pretty interesting window into how um, the structural racism protests and U.S. exonerations all sort of have this broad interplay across the data set that we've been working with. Um, that's about all that I've got. And I don't know if Ariek, if you want to add anything else, but I'm all set.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, and we hope that you enjoyed our project.